Hello and welcome to The Right Idea, where we discuss the people, policy, and politics that drive Texas. I'm your host, Brian Phillips. I'm the Chief Communications Officer at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and with me, as always, is our Vice President of Research, Derek Cohen. Derek, we're going to jump into some really important issues today, as we always like to do, but I like at the very top to get your hot takes of the week. You've got a hot take that you want to get out there, so I'll let you introduce it.
Well, I certainly you saw when this was post, the controversy, the scandal of Donald Trump working at McDonald's, but turns out he never actually interviewed at McDonald's.
Wow,
I don't know if you saw that.
No, that's it. Who was that? The Atlantic? Did they post that?
I don't know. But brave, truth-telling journalists.
Those
certainly.
cushy no-show jobs that Trump was getting at McDonald's?
Yeah, exactly. I was going to say, working the drive-through window, take us all back. But then, I believe it was on his Truth Social.
Another scandal.
Yeah, there's this one, I can't qualify fitness after this. Tweeted a picture that may have been, allegedly, they don't want to accuse, but it have been AI generated of him in a Pittsburgh Steelers jersey.
And just like wearing a jersey?
No, like full kit.
Oh,
in Heinz Field or whatever.
So shoulder pads and everything.
Mm-hmm.
So wait a minute. The campaign was trying to fool the swing state voters in Pennsylvania that Donald Trump actually played linebacker for the Pittsburgh Steelers at one point.
Well, that was the question though, because everyone wants to say linebacker. I don't think he'd be a linebacker. You actually have to do some analysis on where do you think he would do, like with the frame and everything.
Well, for his time period, maybe fullback.
That's exactly what I was going to.
Okay,
I'm talking like a straight up Mike Allstott like level fullback. Toting the rock. But here's the thing, though. Nobody goes under center these days, right? Everyone's on a shotgun. So, you could run like a pistol formation or something like that. So that begs the question, if you're playing fantasy, do you get to flex Trump into the wide receiver spot because he qualifies as a halfback? Or is he just going to be, amalgamated into a broader offense?
It really depends on your commissioner, I think, at that point. So, so you're telling me that this controversy, it was Newsweek that reported this, and they literally, they seriously reported it as some sort of scandal in the campaign that Trump was trying to fool swing state voters into believing that he played in the NFL.
Yeah, again, they said allegedly, so the fact we still need to get all the facts.
Yeah,
but yeah, huge if true. If it turns out that the president in his 70s is not an active NFL player.
Oh, that's right, because it was a picture of him now.
Oh yeah.
It wasn't even a picture of him from the 80s.
It was traditional black and gold. It was a traditional black and gold. But remember, we're if we want to go throwback, we do the Bumblebee uniforms.
Yeah,
remember that?
Right. That's right. Yeah. All right. Well, moving on to the real issues of the day.
How's that not a real issue?
Yeah. We'll get into campaign stuff later. But of course, my favorite part of the show is always our shameless promotion. If you're not signed up for the Post, it's our weekly newsletter. It sort of has like a compilation of everything we're working on here at TPPF. A lot of these kinds of hot takes and some fun stuff. Always Texas related at the end. You can sign up for that at texaspolicy.com/thepost. Sign up for that today. All right. Well, let's get to why we're here. And why we're here is the return of the man, James Quintero, who is the policy director for our Taxpayer Protection Project here at TPPF. James, welcome back. I think you were one of our very first guests ever on the pod, back when we were just a little pod, scrappy little pod, trying to make it in the world. So welcome back to the show.
I was worried I said something bad. It's been a while.
Well, we've got bigger guests now. We've got state reps, we've got like the experts from DC come on. We got remote guests and things like that.
And we're trying to keep our all ages rating.
Oh.
Yeah, back in the day we used to just Derek and I would run around the third floor and be like, who wants to be on a podcast? And James, but
a lot of doors closing.
So James is the policy director at basically one of our biggest campaigns, the Taxpayer Protection Project here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and that encompasses a lot. That is I think on our Liberty Action agenda you have more than 24 items I think that are responsible for getting across the finish line during session. It's spending, it's taxes, it's budget, it's election integrity in a few ways, and a bunch of other issues. But one of the main number one issues, of course, that you're known for around these parts and up the street is government accountability, government transparency. This is one of my favorite issues, certainly to work on and to poll, because this is truly, we talk about 80-20 issues, James. This is really more like a 90 to who question mark issue, like who's not for government transparency and accountability. Can you take us through, kind of just give us the environment environment for like what should be the right approach? Like, what's the idea? I mean, most people think, hey, government should be accountable and transparent, but like, what does that really mean when the rubber hits the road?
Well, it's a good question. And you're right. We do have a robust agenda at the Taxpayer Protection Project. It's one of the reasons you see me grouch about so many different things on Twitter. When it comes to transparency, one thing that I think more people are waking up to is the fact that really the state's transparency laws are fundamentally broken. And one of the reasons I say that is we've had this Public Information Act system, which actually started off as the Texas Open Records Act back in '73. We've had this law intact for about 50 years, and it started off, I think, quite well. It resulted out of a major scandal, the Sharpstown scandal, and policymakers at the time really wanted to do something big. They wanted to restore public trust in a major way, and so they came up with TORA, which again later became the TPIA, and installed something that I think was hugely beneficial. But what's happened over the last 50 years is you've seen a chipping away at that system. And what we have today really doesn't work in the way it should. And I think it overly favors governmental secrets. And so one of the things that we're really championing moving into 2025 is a set of different reforms, and we can get into that a little later. But I think there is room for major improvement. And I'll end with this. The current environment really requires something major to be done on the transparency stage, because I think we find ourselves in a place where public trust is reaching the bottom, right? We really have a lack of confidence in our institutions, and that's not Texas specific. I think that's a nationwide critique, but we really need to do some big things to restore public trust.
Well, so let me ask you. I know we've had these conversations but for benefits of the listeners, like give us examples of like where it is broken. Give examples of where the bottom gives out.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, for anybody who's familiar with submitting a Public Information Act request, anybody who's nosy like me, you know that right off the bat, you need to structure your request in a particular way, because if there's even a missing comma or a punctuation that's incorrect, or the question isn't phrased exactly right, what the governmental body may do is wait 10 days and then ask for clarification. So you've already wasted a week and a half of time, right? And sometimes what they'll do is they'll seek to draw things out in the hopes that you just go away. Right? Because at a certain point, a news story or a question no longer becomes relevant. And so, if you don't get that initial phrasing exactly right, the governmental body will perhaps draw things out and make you jump through some additional hoops. Once they receive the question, there's probably a good chance too that the information that ought to be public is going to fall under one of 75 different exceptions.
75.
And that number has grown tremendously over the years. When TORA was actually first enacted, again, back in the 70s, policymakers had 16 different exceptions included in the law. And so over time, over the last 50 years, that's grown to 75. And it's not just the number of exceptions. We're also talking the breadth of exceptions has grown as well. And so
then they can broadly interpret those exceptions too. I mean, even in cases where they're talking specifically about, tradecraft, or they're talking specifically about, financial information that really shouldn't be public for say a private contractor or something, but now they extend that out to pricing.
Yeah.
Right? Like, how did you come up with your number to, how did you're charging the government $5 million. How did you come up with your number? Oh, that's pricing information that should be covert. You talk about the PIA, and the PIA was the one that got in place after TORA. The beginning of this, I mean, the preamble to this law really states kind of the philosophy of like what this law is supposed to do to protect the public. It says that government agencies do not have, quote, the right to decide what is good for the people to know and what is not good for them to know, right? Like the government agencies don't get to decide that. That's really the purview of leadership who is elected, right? The people who serve the people, but government agencies don't get to decide this. And that in order to hold public servants accountable for the decisions that they make and the money they spend, quote, the people insist on remaining informed, but the current system really doesn't allow the people to remain informed, as you're talking about. And there's all these different games that they play. I think in one of your papers, you called it disregard, delay, and deny. And that's really the process there, which is disregard the request. Just ignore it as long as you can until you start to see if somebody, makes a stink about it. And then you'll essentially delay at that point. Like once you have to respond, like you said, wait until the 10-day period is up, ask another question. Did you mean to say and, or did you mean to say or? And that opens up a new window of 10 days or whatever for you to respond and for them to respond. And then basically at the end, and we're seeing this in some other cases that we'll get into some specific cases, at the end, they just deny it based on these wide interpretations or all of these various exceptions. As somebody who has to be part of this process, and we've got friends in the media that talk to us about, they're trying to get information from government agencies too. Like, how much of your time do you, because you get paid to do this. I mean, frankly, this is like why part of the reason why you're here is because you got to be the bulldog.
You're getting
after
paid?
this. Yeah. I didn't say, I just said, we give you Chick-fil-A every third Thursday. Just talk us through the process about the frustration about, the preamble says specifically government agencies don't get to do this. Like the deference should be on providing information to the public. And yet now they're misusing the laws to create a system where they don't have to give information to the public.
So I think from a 30,000-foot view, one of the greatest frustrations is knowing what the law aspires to do as it's laid out in 552.001, right? And
everybody catch that?
I rarely do this. I want to encourage the audience to go read the government code 552.001. It's a very short paragraph, but what it lays forth is a very aspirational framework that policymakers intended to animate the rest of the code, right? They wanted to set forth this vision of what government transparency ought to be. It even talks about government being the servant, not the master of the people. I mean, rarely do you find, such language in codified law. And you look and see what it is that they were trying to do and what it is that we have today.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just totally, what makes you want to pull your hair out, because you're right. Governmental entities all too frequently deny, delay, and disregard. And fun aside, this isn't a new problem. Long ago, when I was a much younger man, first starting off here, I was actually hired thanks to a grant from the Franklin Center, I believe. And the intent of the grant was to go out and capture budgets, annual financial reports, and check registers and put them all in one location. And we launched this website called Texas Budget Source. And so it was chiefly upon me to go out and submit PIAs to all these governmental bodies, 5,000, right? 5,000 governmental bodies. And the small guys, I would say your more targeted special districts in particular didn't give a hoot. They would ignore you. I would call them on the phone. I would pester them by email. I would say, hey, Attorney General, this little small water district doesn't give two hoots about my PIA request. What can we do here? And it was just, it didn't matter. Like we rarely got anywhere with those smaller jurisdictions. So what this tells me is that this problem has long been around. Today, I think it's gotten a little bit worse because, again, we operate in an environment today where public trust in our institutions is nearing an all-time low, if it's not already there.
Yeah.
And so,
do you think that there's, I mean, on the spectrum, is it just, laziness? Is it, they just don't care, all the way up to, they're actually hiding some sort of public corruption? And of course, I want to be careful there that we're not making any accusations, or inferences, but but all of that exists, right? I mean, it could, the law is there to protect the right of the citizens to know, and yet you have people whose job it is to provide that information, and yet they either don't care, or they're lazy, or they don't feel like it's important, and they're not prioritizing it, all up into something that potentially could look like, corrupt actors gaming the system for millions of taxpayer dollars.
I think part of it has to do with the nature of the inquiries. And what I mean is social media has enabled us to share information in a way that's never been done before. And so now, as I'm perusing Twitter or Facebook or whatever other social media platform, I'm able to sniff out different things that I would never have any sense to know to ask about, right? And I think there are others like me who go out there and try and sift through a lot of these different rumors and allegations to get to the truth. And so the questions that are being posed to governmental entities are a bit more, I don't want to say informed, but at least inquisitive. And I think because of that, because we're sniffing around in a way that's never been done before, they're probably a bit more guarded, and there's probably a lot of dirt they're trying to cover up as well. I go back to
Mismanagement, and it doesn't even have to be corruption, right? It's just mismanagement or laziness or inefficiency or whatever.
So I'll give you an example. The foundation is actually involved in a lawsuit against Highland Park ISD. And what our litigation team uncovered not too long ago was the fact that there were a couple of employees at Highland Park ISD who were effectively stealing from the district, right? They were providing some, I believe it was tennis services to, outside groups. Those groups were paying in cash, and those individuals were skimming, right? And this happened over a long period of time. And when the district caught wind of it, they said, whoa, whoa, whoa. They put a stop to it. And then they hired a group, Whitley Penn, to figure out, well, how long has this been going on and what can we do about it? So the report, which was put together by a bunch of financial non-attorney types, was then returned to the district. And one of the ways that the district has sought to withhold the information in the report, because it was embarrassing, is they CC'd their attorney, right? And so they have engineered some creative new ways to withhold public data and documents by manipulating the law,
claiming it's privileged,
claiming it falls under the attorney-client privilege. And our guys say, whoa, 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 this is a public document that was commissioned by a governmental entity and put together by a bunch of non-attorney types. How is this not?
And right up until the moment when they CC'd the lawyer, you're thinking, hey, these guys are doing the right thing.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, they put a stop to it. They owned up to it. They hired an outside firm to investigate how it happened, maybe, and the prospects of figure out how to make sure this doesn't ever happen again. And you're thinking, here we go, somebody who actually took some responsibility for it, but then the report will never be public, because they're trying to engineer this exception, essentially.
You're right. And I think one of the most troubling aspects to this is oftentimes these practices, they don't stay limited to one governmental entity, right? Because oftentimes these law firms are in, it's usually the same law firms and the same organizations that hire them. These practices tend to spread. And so word is that other governmental entities have started to abuse the attorney-client privilege as well. And so it's another reason why I think we've got to revisit some of the law and really either reform what exists or just jettison a lot of the bad stuff. And
the 75 exceptions and things like that they're hiding behind. Another example is one that we're working on right now in at TPPF is, Round Rock ISD signed a contract with a vendor for $5 million, and there's no information about what, the two basic questions here, right? Which is, not accusing anybody of anything, just saying, hey, there's $5 million. That's a lot of money. This isn't like some $10,000, one-time thing where they mowed the grass or something. This is a $5 million contract, and the specifics of the contract are a little bit open-ended. There's not really any specific details about this. And so we asked, and I think others have asked the district, okay, how much, what was the money for, and what services are you going to provide? In other words, like what service are you saying that you're going to provide, and then how do you price that to get to $5 million? I mean, two simple questions. Just explain how you got to the number, and explain what you're going to do. And it's like, it's like you would have asked for like their the passcode for their iPhone or something. I mean, it was like, alert, stop. And, we got, communications from the vendors, and Round Rock ISD is now appealed after delaying. They have now appealed to the AG, which the whole point of the story is that's another way in which, it's not just including their lawyers on this and claiming privilege, but now when you get to the end of this, they appeal to the Attorney General, who, is doing good work, but may or may not have time to deal with something like this, or at least in a timely manner. And so they know that they're creating another delay there by essentially sending it all the way up to the AG.
Let's not move past that point a little too quickly, because I think you hit on something that where it is kind of highlights the, I don't want to use that word, but there's we'll say the close relationship that they have. Because if we're receiving communication from the vendor who's pissed that people are sniffing around their hands in the public till, that means that there's collusion on the back end between the actual government entity and the vendor itself, not necessarily for the purpose of answering the actual information request, but so that they could call and say, like, what are you doing, and send nasty grams and things like that. That is absolutely inappropriate.
Any other examples that we're working on?
Yeah, but before we move past this, I do want to broach a point, because oftentimes what will happen is a governmental entity will enter into a contractual arrangement with a third party, private sector vendor. And when anybody starts snooping around,
Taxpayer photo lobbyists.
What they'll say is, well, we can't give you the contractual information because there's some sort of proprietary information in there, right? And what always occurs to me is the fact that why are we requiring third parties to include their secret sauce in any contract, right? That contract ought to be, most of it ought to be disclosable to the public and not require anything special of these vendors,
right?
And so that's another frustration in the system that I think prevents a lot of information from being released, and I'll let you decide whether that's intentional or not. But it's another signal that we need to get to a place of reform. You asked about another example.
Well, I was going to say, to follow up on that, I mean, just to put a stamp on that point. Yeah. Why are we who's asking for their tradecraft? Yeah. Like, who's asking for how you approach strategy, or how you approach, doing things in an efficient way, or doing, or providing your service in a way that is superior to another, to another firm that might be your competitor. No one, why is anyone asking for that information in these contracts? All we're really asking for is, provide some information on what service, just the services you will provide, and then give us an explanation on how you got to that number, to ask, for the contract to be millions of dollars or whatever. And so, for the fact, that information seems like something that's very basic that the public should know about. So you're right. Like, why are they even including, if this is legitimate, right? Even if they're making a legitimate claim that there is proprietary information there, why are we asking for that? And why is that being included in the contract to begin with?
It's a great question. And by the way, if you look at the original construction of the law, and even as it was recodified in the 90s, I think policymakers always intended for publicly supported entities, even of a private sector nature, to disclose what they were doing and why, right? If you look at the law, it's very clear. In fact, I was in the Senate State Affairs Committee the other day talking about this very provision, which, it says, basically any organization that spends or that is supported in whole or in part by public funds should be subject to these open government requirements. And yet, because of, I would say, some poorly constructed court decisions, as well as a series of very bad legislative reforms, we've moved away from this this requirement, and now the public really can't get a firm grasp on what a government is doing with a vendor and why.
Mm-hmm. So you were going to give us another example?
Yeah, again, I'm a nosy person. And so anytime I see anything of interest in the newspapers in particular, I think, well, okay, let me see if I can explore that little detail a bit more. And so I was actually nosing around the Dallas Morning News's website one day in August of last year. And I ran across a statement in the article that said, Dallas officials sent a letter to State Rep Raphael Anchia in March listing more than 100 rules and policies in Dallas's city code that they believe would be upended by the Death Star law. And of course, we all know what the Death Star law is. That is the field preemption measure enacted last session that was supposed to get.
We've had a lot of fun with that.
Yeah,
one
I mean, it's a terrific law. So I saw this bit of detail and I thought, goodness, the city of Dallas knows which rules and regulations are potentially subject to the law and potentially overturned. I want to know what that list says. And so I went to the city of Dallas almost immediately with a PIA request. And I said, hey, I saw this. Let me get your list. I would love it. They waited the full 10 days before letting me know, hey, we're going to go to the AG's office to see if we can withhold this data, right? And so, September expires. We move through October, no word. And then in November, the AG's office says, no, we think Quintero's request is okay. City of Dallas, you've got to turn over that information. And when I received that request, I thought, finally, we're going to get down to the bottom of what it is that the city of Dallas knows that the rest of us ought to know too, right? Mm-hmm. And so I made sure that the city of Dallas had that information. I sent an email to their PIA person that, hey, I'm waiting, come on with it, and then dead silence, right? Mm-hmm. And so about a month goes by, and finally I'm frustrated.
There's the disregard.
Yes, I'm frustrated. I'm thinking, what the heck? I have a letter from the AG's office telling me that I'm in the right. I should have access to that information. I'm going to fire off a nasty email to the city of Dallas. And Rob says, you know what?
Rob, our general counsel.
Our general counsel advised me that I ought to just give them a call, be friendly, be nice. And of course he's right.
Oh, that must have killed you.
Right. It did kill me a little inside. I did take his advice there, and I called up and
did you tweet?
Had a great, I thought about it. Had a great exchange with the PIA officer. And what he revealed was, after contacting the city attorney's office, he discovered, the city attorney's office has initiated litigation in Travis County contesting the AG's ruling without notifying me. And he said they were in the right because I was not party to the lawsuit. And I thought, well, this all started because I asked a question. You should at least have the common courtesy to notify me, and said, okay, I understand where you're coming from, but now that I know the situation, let me take action on my own. Mm-hmm. And so it was at that point where we reached out to some friendly reporters, let them know the situation. They went to work and they uncovered the actual list by going to Representative Anchia's office, asking for comment on the lawsuit. And Representative Anchia's office said, here's the list. Thereby
maybe you should have tried that first.
Mooting the whole thing, right? So we now know what it is exactly that the city of Dallas was trying to withhold.
But I think you bring up, that's even further than some of these other cases where it's like they send it to the AG, as a way to continue the process going. And you would have presumed that maybe that would end it, but apparently not. Now the AG can rule in your favor, and then they can contest what the AG's ruling.
In a Travis County court, and we all know how conservatives fare in that venue.
Yeah, good luck with that. Well,
if only there was another jurisdiction that just established for matters of state import.
That's another show. So you mentioned the media. So I want to get to that because you do a lot. I mean, this is, it's strange bedfellows here. I mean, liberal media and conservative think tanks don't generally mesh well together. But on this issue, again, as I said at the top, this is really a 90-10 issue, a 95-5 issue. And so it does bring together left, right, and center and some strange bedfellows and various activists on different sides. I mean, I think some of the stuff that we're doing in Houston and pushing them to reveal some information is we're partnering with groups and organizations who we wouldn't want normally in the first place. So that's very interesting, and you have, or I guess Texas has, I'm not sure who puts this on, but it's called Sunshine Week. Is that part of the highlighting these issues and transparency and all of that? And what's that about?
Yeah, it's a great question. So every March nationwide, we celebrate something known as Sunshine Week. And basically, it's a celebration of government transparency. We usually use that opportunity to try and push the message on transparency and why it matters, right? Because, of course, from our view, you need transparency in order to get accountability, and you need accountability to get public trust. So I think we do reach a wide audience with that message. Again, to your point, everybody cares about transparency. It's really hard to oppose transparency unless you're trying to hide something. And then you find yourself opposed. And by the way, I've been in committee a lot with various lobbyists on the other side who are arguing against transparency. And it's always funny to watch them dance because it's such a hard concept to argue against. But yeah, Sunshine Week, looking forward to it this year in particular because it'll occur during the legislative session at a really important time, which is right when the process really kicks into gear. Lawmakers are taking up all sorts of items. It's going to be fast and furious. And I'm hoping that by the time Sunshine Week rolls around, at least one chamber will have considered one or more of our various measures. And we'll see that process unfold.
That's a good transition into the reforms then is what are we looking at in terms of, because this seems like, man, it's not going to be some tweaks here and tweaks there. I mean, we've got to have almost kind of a wholesale, maybe like we did in 93 with the TPIA. Do we need to have another overhaul of this? Because clearly now that the law has 75 exceptions and even those exceptions are being overly broadly, or overly a broad interpretation of those. Do we need some kind of overhaul, or do you have some fixes that would get us there?
It's a good question. Let me start here. It is a big lift, but I feel confident with not only the solutions that we've solidified internally, but also with an external group that we have partnered with, some good friends led by the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas, some really smart people who I think are going to partner at least on some of these reforms with us. And so when you think about what do we do, okay, well, we've got two papers that I hope will get through the publication process soon. Fingers crossed. One of which
feel attacked.
No. Jeez, if only we could get some people working on some research around here.
No, the fault is mine. But
you can. I'll tell you what. You said submit something to Marie, and I'll get back to you in 10 days.
So the first one deals with exceptions, right? So again, we have a lot of exceptions, and they're broadly construed. What we are attempting to do is work through the law and identify which ones are not good from that original perspective of government not being the master, right? And so we go through the law, we identify which exceptions we ought to toss, and we identify which exceptions ought to be more narrowly tailored, like the attorney-client privilege, right? And so it's this big, meaty document that, again, I hope will come out within the next little bit. The second one also comes at it from the originalist perspective in that we want to make a definitional change. And I know that sounds small and not worthy really, but when you consider the definitional change that we want to make, I think it has the potential to unlock a lot of secrets. And what I mean is, if you look at the way the law was originally constructed, again, it was constructed in a way that private sector entities who were mostly funded by public sources, those entities had to observe the PIA. right? We want to get back to that place. And the recommendation put forward in the paper is to make a definitional change so that groups like the Texas Association of School Boards, the Texas Municipal League, the Texas Association of Counties, all of whom operate as quasi-governmental entities and are funded mostly by public sources, those entities ought to answer to public inquiry, right? They ought to be able to receive and respond to Public Information Act requests so that we can start learning how they're spending money. Where are they getting it from? Are we getting a good ROI? Right? And I think that takes us back to the original intent of the law, which is if you're taking public money, then you're under some extra responsibility to answer for what you're doing with the public's money.
So it's not just that the school district, who spends money, and so that would be an obvious one. The school district has to tell you how to do it. But if they hand over millions of dollars to one of these organizations, that's sort of a quasi, the Association of School Boards, the Association of educators or something like that, and they're getting the vast majority of their operating funds from public sources, we treat those organizations like we would treat the schools, and they can't hide behind being, these quasi-private organizations when in fact they're basically de facto public.
Yeah, and again, these are entities that are almost entirely funded through public sources, and probably would not exist were those funding sources eliminated, right? And so, but the way they've been able to skirt the law is that, they'll advance the claim, well, we're not government, so we shouldn't be required to observe PIA standards. And it's just, I think it's a bastardization of the law, and we want to get back to the place where the public fully understands what's being done with its money and resources.
If your hand is in my pocket, turn yours out.
Exactly. Yeah. Wow, well said. Yeah.
And that would be different than, say you have a construction company that might build some schools, but really the business is, building, building buildings or building apartment buildings or something like that. That they might have some government contracts, but like the bulk of their business is still much more in terms of the private sector. A huge distinction from these other organizations that are almost entirely, if not entirely, funded by the ISDs or by, various agencies.
So
agencies.
The way we've established the threshold in our paper, at least, is that if 90% of your operating budget comes from the government or more comes from the taxpayer, then you are now required to observe the PIA, right? And what makes the associations, these pro-government associations, particularly pernicious is the fact that they not only take in money from all sorts of sources that the public really can't understand or know about, but then much of those resources are funneled back into legislative lobbying for more resources. Right. And so it's this dark cycle that we're trying to break frankly, and understand.
To prevent laws like this from being done on the books. I mean, when we've been talking about the delay, disregard, do you have anything, that would get to this, to them essentially abusing this system by ignoring you, delaying, using these tactics to delay, and then at the end denying and appealing and all that stuff? Is there a way to get at that? It seems like that's a lot of the problem. Is there a way to get at that somehow?
Yeah, one of the things that we've long toyed with is increasing penalties for governmental bodies who either excessively petition the AG's office to withhold data and documents, or who just flagrantly flout the law. And it's not just this area where I think some additional enforcement muscle is needed. I think when you look at the local government landscape as a whole, you see lots of lawlessness, and you see the very obvious need for some sort of enforcement mechanism. But in this area in particular, there's probably a lot of room for either some sort of punitive financial measure, extra training requirements, or something along those lines to really make people take notice of the law and observe it, because it's in the best public interest to do so.
Well, let me ask you, James, and I don't want to tie us down on this topic too long. But I want to say is I'm going to go out, and this is one of the rare times where I think I'm going to be a little more radical than you.
Oh, yeah.
We'll have to actually bookmark this in the feed. But the problem is you talk about financial penalties. that hits the taxpayer twice, right? So it's like, not only is somebody being a poor steward of taxpayer money, but they are also then, if they are found guilty and taken and judged against, then the taxpayer has to fund that judgment, right? It's not punitive to the individual.
Right.
So allow me to proffer an idea to you. What if we actually make a doctrine of exposure to individual liability for the people who vexatiously petition the AG, so on and so forth?
Oh, I like it. And in fact, you may or may not have been privy to these conversations, but one of the things we're kicking around, and we haven't formalized this yet, but I think there is some interest in developing an escalating series of punishments. So if you're a governmental entity and you're like, nah, you know what? I don't have to observe that PIA request, and that happens on numerous instances, then maybe that is, either step one or step two of an escalating series of punishments that ultimately ends with, the governmental entity not being able to adopt a budget or a tax rate above the no new revenue tax rate, right? So, I mean, let's just freeze everything, right? And then when you get out of timeout, then maybe things return to normal. But there's got to start being some sort of enforcement mechanism that these governmental bodies take notice of and are motivated by, because there's far too much lawlessness in effect.
I would just push back and say that still targets the institution instead of the bad actors there within.
And I think, holding officials personally liable could absolutely be incorporated into those escalating steps.
But, since most government bodies think it's their money,
so
it does actually hit, they don't think of it as like, oh, this is just more taxpayer money. I mean, if you are taking, freezing their budgets, I mean, that's something, I mean, you hear that right now about districts, screaming about, the revenue and all of that right now. So they definitely would take notice if you were going to freeze their budgets. So, all right, well, we're getting into the 10-minute drill. So we want to, James, if you'll stick around with us and have a little fun with us on some of our thumbs, but thank you for being here with us. This is a great issue. Again, this is one of those things that just transcends politics and ideology and certainly partisanship. And so we're going to continue at it and get to a point to where, the public does in fact enforce their right to know. So we'll get there. All right. So we'll jump into our 3 segments that we always like to end the show with. The first one is Survey Says. This is where we run down the latest and greatest in polling and survey information. One thing that jumped out to me this week, a new hobby poll. This is the University of Houston's poll. Great poll, good legitimate polling that they do down there. New poll shows that 48% of Texas Latinos are now supporting Trump. That is a 10% increase over 2020. I mean, that really jumps out to me and not that Texas is necessarily in play for the presidential, but the fact that Texas Latinos, you've seen such a massive jump. I mean, for someone who follows polling the way that I do, to see that kind of double-digit jump from one presidential election to the next is massive, and it really opens your eyes. What do y'all make of that? I mean, is this something that's like a trend that's been in the coming, or?
I think Brian's trying to get me fired.
Yeah, or he's going to try to get me to opine on Latinos while James Quintero is sitting right next to me.
I think the point is, like, yes, it's in the context of elections and all of that, so we need to be careful with our 501c3. But I think the point is that if people, if a certain group, particularly a group as important as Latinos are in Texas as a voting bloc, what does that mean for the future of Texas, and then what does that mean even for policy in Texas?
Well, I think I obviously this is that in and of itself we could do a whole show on. I think we might have, but that in and of itself I think reflects the fact that people are not judged in a vacuum. They're judged again, in an era of negative valence voting. We're saying, what is Donald Trump vis-a-vis Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, right? Mm-hmm. And I think this actually shows that, look, I mean, the values of this large segment of the voting bloc, which is not a monolith, I hasten to add.
Sure, yeah.
Thinks about, evaluates the issues, scores them in a rubric the same way that Anglos do, in the same way that African-American Texans do. Mm-hmm. A lot of the folks that are coming in of, Asian descent do. And that's all the thing that, again, there is a core being to being Texan. We just talked about this yesterday. There's a core being to being Texan, and one particular program speaks to that better than the other. And I think this is where it's actually bearing out.
Yeah, James, when you really dig down on the data here, I mean, and this goes to, the Latino population, which has traditionally been, even recently, traditionally been much more in the Democrat camp. When you dig down on this, even amongst men and women, you see now amongst Latino men, there's a 9% favorable towards Trump. I mean, it's actually in Trump's camp now. It's not even 50-50 anymore. And even among women, which has been a difficult group for Trump to attract, is now Latino women is it only at -2, so it's within the margin of error. So I mean, this is a major shift. This is a massive shift in the direction of conservatives.
I think there's two factors here. One of which is there's a hunger for a machismo of sorts, right? In the Hispanic culture, I think it's quite natural to have kind of a leading figure of the family. And when you look at that through the governmental prism, it's very clear that there's an absence of leadership, and there's a hunger for a return of some sort of strong male figure. The second thing I'd point out, though, and I can relate this from personal experience. I don't like to admit this, but I'm actually from California. I got here in the 90s, but I'm actually from California. I still have a lot of family out in California. We've agreed to never talk politics, but they have started to broach me of late with, I would say, a softening stance toward Trump. And my
Becoming Trump curious.
family on that side is kind of the yellow dog Democrat type, Clinton-esque Democrats. But they have started to soften their view towards him, largely because of the immigration issue. And I think they come at it both from a fairness perspective as well as the burden that it brings. And because of the problems that illegal immigration has created, particularly in California, they're really starting to reconsider some political views. Now, are they going to vote Trump? I don't know. But I can definitely tell you they are rethinking some old political paradigms in ways that I've never seen before.
Yeah. Yeah, and of course we accept all people here. I mean, California. I mean, our fantastic producer Jefferson is a California.
Once he got out of
so.
quarantine, he was great.
Yeah, this is sort of a purgatory. And of course, Chuck DeVore, who's a big voice here at TPPF.
We disinfect him by covering him in Dr. Pepper, and
we have lots of former Californians who have escaped the People's Republic. So anyway, I thought that was interesting. But you make a really good point about the paradigm shifts, and I think that's something that we watch not just because we're a bunch of political nerds and we like watching that kind of stuff. It really does matter in terms of the shift and attitudes towards public policy and the things that we work on a day-to-day basis. And of course, we want to know where the public is on an issue, and it either tells us they're behind us already on an issue, or they're not, or they don't know, and we need to do some education about that issue. That's really the core of what we do here. And so that's why we watch these paradigm shifts, because if the public is moving in that direction, it means we don't have to spend as much time and resources convincing the public on a particular public policy issue. And so I just thought that was huge, and it was really interesting just because of how large that shift was. Okay, speaking of shifting, we'll get into our second segment, our lies, damn lies, and statistics, where we talk about research. We had a new paper that just dropped this week at TPPF, which was new. It was kind of groundbreaking. It's the first time the EIA, the Energy Information Agency, the Federal Energy Information Agency, puts out, I think, annual totals about things like subsidies for energy sources, right? And this is a big issue within the energy debate because those subsidies affect the markets. They ultimately will either incentivize the right or the wrong policies, and that, of course, ends up on your electric bill or at the gas pump or whatever. So it's a huge issue in terms of how it affects people's daily lives in terms of getting the energy that they need. So our paper went back over the last 14 years and totaled up all of the subsidies, all of the federal subsidies that were going to all of the various sources of energy. And each energy source, wind, solar, nuclear, and fossil fuels, all received around $20 to $80 billion during that time of federal subsidies. Now, what does that mean? Well, wind and solar A lot of people, maybe have this idea that oil and gas are getting all the subsidies, or oil and gas are getting, favorable treatment by people in Texas or the federal government. Not true. Wind and solar have each received more than twice as much in subsidies as oil and gas. And when you really dig down on it, what that means is that the wind and solar really depend on federal subsidies for their profitability. Wind has received 48 times, and solar has received 168 times more in subsidies per unit of electricity generated than oil and gas. And of course, that is creating uncertainty on our grid and all of that. James and Derek would ask you, I mean, what do you make out of this research in terms of how that affects our grid, how that affects the cost of energy for the average Texan?
Well, simply, you get more of what you subsidize, and the fact that we are bringing non-dispatchable sources on to the tune of 48 to 168 times that subsidy is absolutely insane. Unless I keep telling the lawmakers who talk about this, and when you were out that one time and we had Senator King here, we said, well, why don't you just pass a law and say the sun has to shine and the wind has to blow?
Right.
Bid the tide not coming, essentially. And I think that that's one of the problems, because as long as that subsidy shows up, regardless of whether you're and the production credit, regardless of what the need is and where the price of that market is at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's massively distortive. Mm-hmm. And so this is one of the ones where I was at a loss for some of the remedies for, and to a point where now I'm just essentially like, I know Representative Patterson's talking about basically having a countervailing tax to combat the subsidy credit. Now, I would still prefer, basically, production requirements as opposed to a out-and-out production tax. But still, at the end of the day, if the market is so decentralized as we have it, yet so dependent on federal subsidies, it's not a true free market.
Yeah, James, the wind and solar guys would tell you, look, we just, the argument has always been, hey, we're just around the corner. We're just around, just over the horizon. We will be able to be self-sustaining, and we will able to be, to compete on the market. I mean, the technology is almost there. The battery technology, we're so close. It's been 40 years, Is it time to put up or shut up?
So this is actually one of the issues that worries me the most as a Politico. And that's because you want to consider some of the different ways that conservatives can lose control of the legislature. Let's have a repeat of Winter Uri, where people couldn't turn the lights on, and have a repeat of that situation. I think that's going to cause all sorts of political consequences at the legislature, that perhaps even mean, conservatives lose control and progressives take over. Mm-hmm. And so, I think when I don't know the right policy prescriptions for this area, but I know conservatives have to get a handle on reliable energy, mm-hmm. or we risk losing control of the state legislature.
Yeah. We had, of course, the famous quote from Reagan, when he talks about the government's approach to the economy. If it moves, tax it. If it keeps moving, regulate it. And if it stops moving, subsidize it. Which, of course, highlights the stupidity of, if it's dead and the market doesn't want it to move anymore, why are we pumping a bunch of money into it as well? All right, we got a couple minutes left.
Before we close out, I want to nose in, if I could, because you said lies, damn lies, and statistics. And what, of course, it brought to mind is the fact that we're in the midst of voting season right now. I'm working on a short paper dealing with a little requirement that TPPF helped install back in 2019 that forces school districts to tell the public on the ballot, this is a property tax increase. So for any voters who are out there going to cast their vote for or against a bond measure this election cycle, know that school districts are required to tell you this is a property tax increase, and it's true, because there's no such thing as a free lunch. And if government wants to borrow a bunch of money, they are going to have to pay that money back with interest. And that's so right. that line, lies, damn lies, and statistics, brought that forthcoming report to mind, because there's all sorts of ways that school districts are either trying to soften that language or moot it entirely.
There's a new one now where you know how to have that in all caps.
Mhm.
They put the rest of the proposition in all caps
Yep.
now too. So just hope people don't.
Just sneaky. I mean, just be on it. Like I just
This is not a property tax rate increase. This is a property tax increase.
All right. Well, we're gonna have to skip our last segment on what's next. We all know what's next. The election's what's next, and so we're all gonna keep our eyes on that. All right. Well, James, thanks for being here again. Hopefully, it won't be so much time between your next return. We'll have maybe after the election, we'll come back and talk about those bond proposals and see which ones passed and which ones hopefully failed.
Yes.
All right. As always, for my co-host Derek, thanks for being here again, and for you, the listener and the watcher, we really do appreciate you listening, watching our podcast every other week or so. And as we like to say in close, as always, in the words of the famous Sam Houston, do good and risk the consequences. We'll see you next time.